In this video, I'll explain how we recommend to implement the OT-based OT asset management system. For this roadmap that I'm going to present, we assume that you have already finished an OT-based proof of concept. However, you can also get some ideas from the roadmap if you are starting to plan a proof of concept, because some of the different tasks will also be addressed usually in a proof of concept, so you might also get some ideas on how to organize things for your POC. Anyhow, so here we assume that you are past POC, and here we have broken down the various steps and stages on what we believe is the best, the quickest and most efficient way towards a full OT-based implementation. In order to ease your planning, we have provided a project file for a Microsoft project that you can download in our customer download portal. So if we look at all the tasks that are outlined here in this left area, then you can quickly realize that we have different color codes that represent different areas or product areas actually. All the tasks in blue, they refer to OT-based asset center, whereas the tasks in green refer to OT-based asset discovery. And finally, we have a yellow block. This refers to tasks that are about integration with other software, such as SIEM or another CMDB product. Before we get into details, let me point out that you will see three major milestones in this whole process. The first is up here, where we have OT-based asset center up and running. The second milestone is that you have an initial set of asset discovery nodes up and running. And the third milestone is that you have onboarded active users. Almost all of the durations that we have put into the project are rough estimates. In some cases, we just cannot come up with any specific numbers because they depend on your sizing. So for example, down here we have the deployment of the second wave of asset discovery nodes, and that totally depends on the number of nodes that you want to implement, and certainly also on the location of those nodes. So for example, if you are covering, let's say, 50 different sites all over the globe, that will probably take you a little bit more time than you're only dealing with one site. So with that having said, let's just jump right into the details. The first block of activities is about setting up OT-based asset center. It starts with the configuration of your production server, and actually the specific details on what needs to be done here are very simple, and therefore we have input only a 1-day duration. Certainly we also assume that you have been through this process before during the proof of concept. But anyhow, just to break it down, first you need to provide a host that already has Docker installed. Then you install OT-based asset center from your distribution medium, and that is done with one simple command. So all you need to do is to execute the installation script. That's it. The next step in the installation process is to configure HTTPS access, for which you must copy your certificate, your SSL certificate, into this folder that is outlined right here. The certificate is required for HTTPS access. That means that your users will be able to log on using an encrypted link so that their access credentials cannot be discovered in the data stream. The next step and the last step in the installation process is to install your license key that you have received from us, and that is done in the maintenance area. Or you go to license, and here is the installation area, or here is where you provide your license file along with the password that you have received. After a successful installation, you will see information about your license in this left block down here, where, for example, the number of devices is specified, and maybe also an expiration date if you are using a POC license, or if you have purchased an annual subscription. So that's basically it for that task. And as you see, we think this can and should be done within 1 day. The next task is to configure a staging server, and that is optional. We strongly recommend that you install a staging server, because sooner or later you will want to explore the various features and capabilities of OT-based Asset Center, and specifically you will want to use the REST API for uploading metadata that you have already stored elsewhere, so for example in Excel sheets, etc. And this always includes the risks that you accidentally overwrite data, that you modify data because your Python script doesn't work properly, etc. And for this reason, we recommend that you set up a staging server that you can do for any kind of testing without having to worry about your users, your end users, and your data. And so the process basically is the same. The only difference is later when you use the staging server, you would not direct the asset discovery nodes to send asset discovery data to the staging server, but you would populate the staging server from your production server using a backup file. Next step is to organize for database backup. And OT-based Asset Center already has an automated backup functionality built in. It will automatically produce database backups every 12 hours. Those backups will land in a specific folder, which is simply called /var/ot-base/backup. Now, what you want to make sure is that the files that end up in that folder are transferred to a permanent location, to permanent storage, or at least to external storage, so that if your host crashes for some reason, like your virtual machine crashes, that you can restore from those external backups. Next task is to set up a location namespace. And this is totally underestimated by most customers. And it has to do with the fact that many organizations don't necessarily already have such a namespace in place. So what do we mean by that? You want to make sure that all the locations that you want to refer in your asset inventory are organized in a systematic manner. And to give you an idea, let's switch over to Asset Center. And let's inspect the location directory of a populated Asset Center. So this is what you see in inventory and locations selected in the sidebar. This is a location in directory. And what you want to make sure is that you have set up this structure already, like how you want to reference to the various locations where your OT devices reside. At the very least, you want to make sure that you have identified your sites, assuming that you are going to install asset discovery nodes in multiple sites. And the trick is, or the important step is, that you end up with a nomenclature that includes both a location name, like in this case Flatrock, and also a location ID, which in this case is FRK. Now, why is that so super important? First, it is super important because you want to be able to find specific devices in your device inventory. So let's just go to the devices inventory, and once that I have set up my locations, then ultimately I'll be able to tell OT-base not only show me devices in a particular site or in a particular plant area, building, or even a cabinet. The second reason why this is super important is that you can also, and most likely will, use the location namespace in order to define access rights. So for any user group, you can and most likely will limit access in respect to locations. So for example, if I tell OT-base, well, the inventory access for this user group is limited to anything located in machine room 16, and I disable the general read access, then members of this user group will only be able to access data for devices that are located in that particular machine room. And finally, and maybe most notably, the locations are extremely important because they allow us, or allow you, to deal with duplicate IP addresses. And this is where asset discovery comes into play. So it is quite common in OT that you're using duplicate IP addresses such as 192.168.0.0. And also another example would be anytime you use field buses like Sercos or Profibus, like in this example, we can only distinguish those networks by their location. And for this reason, it is very important that you provide proper location IDs for asset discovery. So what you see here is the location ID for the node, which acts like the global default for all devices that are discovered by this node. And then you can also provide location IDs for individual networks, like you see here, or for individual devices. If you do that, and you should do that, and we'll get back to that later when we talk about asset discovery, then your devices will automatically put into the right spot, into the right location in that tree. And this is what you want to make sure. Next task is to add user groups and access rights. And now you understand why this requires that the previous task was finished, because in almost any case, you will want to use your location namespace for defining access rights. You want to be able to tell OT-based Asset Center, well, the members of this group are only allowed to access device data from devices in that location. Once that you have your location namespace in place, defining the user groups is not very difficult, as you have seen earlier. So the only other thing that you want to check here is you most likely would like to use existing user groups from Active Directory. And this is super simple in OT-based because for this you only need to check this box. That to tell OT-based, well, this is an LDAP group. This data, this user data is acquired using LDAP. And then don't forget to specify the domain server with separated with an @ sign, so that OT-base will be able to access this domain server and the specific data. So this is also your path to single sign-on, because once that you have done this and your users are in Active Directory, then you don't need to store them locally on OT-base like this. So this is like the local list of users, but you don't want to do that for all the users once that you import those Active Directory credentials. So with this being complete, you have reached your first milestone, where the Asset Center setup is complete. Now the next block of tasks is marked in green, and this tells us this is all about asset discovery. The first group of tasks is about obtaining credentials for various devices. And as you see, you can start with these 3 tasks here right away. So you don't need to wait until your Asset Center setup is finished. And we strongly recommend that you start right away, because this allows you to move forward quicker. The first subtask here is get credentials for network switches. You want to be able to probe the network switch management networks, because this will ultimately yield you all the connectivity information. So you will be able to see topology diagrams in OT-based Asset Center. And in order to make that happen, we need to be able to retrieve the configuration data from the switches. Now, depending on your switches, this might need some credentials, particularly if you are using SNMP version 3, where authentication is required. Next subtask is to get credentials for ESXi servers. OTBase can automatically discover your hosting structure, your hosting architecture, and this is also accomplished using SNMP. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the asset discovery nodes are able to access those SNMP data sources on your ESXi servers. And when this is possible, then you will see automatically the hosting architecture in OTBase Asset Center. Finally, we have the credentials for Windows machines. We need read access to your Windows boxes if you want to see the installed software, operating system version, and also the installed security patches. If we cannot get access to your Windows boxes, you will not be able to see all the vulnerabilities for those Windows PCs. And usually that accounts for, I would just imagine 90% of the vulnerabilities in a typical OT environment. So you definitely want to make sure that OTBase can access these software configuration informations. And the way to make it happen is to allow for read-only access, preferably via WinRM or Windows Remote Management. The alternative would be WMI for Windows Management Instrumentation, but WinRM is preferred because it allows us to gather more data, which means more accurate vulnerability assessments. There are some pieces of information that we cannot solicit via WMI, so you will see the full picture only if we can use WinRM. For both methods, you will find details on how to configure your machines in the online documentation. So here we have the knowledge base article for WinRM configuration, and here we have the knowledge base article for WMI. Finally, you want to tell Asset Discovery about those credentials, and again, there is a hierarchy how you can provide this information. There are global defaults, which you can find in the default credentials area. And as you see, you can provide multiple credentials and have Asset Discovery check out different credentials if not all your boxes are using one and the same set of credentials. You can do the same thing on a network level. And you can also do the same thing on a device level. Next up is the configuration of network switches for NetFlow or SFlow, which we have marked as optional. So all the tasks that you will see in italics, they are not necessarily required for your Asset Center setup. But it will give you a lot of additional value if you can take advantage of the data flow information. So in a nutshell, what you will gain from that is automatic data flow diagrams. That means both Sankey diagrams, and it will also give you those network style diagrams that really allow for an intuitive understanding of the interactions that a particular device has with other devices. One other thing that it will give you is a quick determination and also an alert mechanism. If a device talks to public IP addresses on the internet, those are automatically highlighted in red, and also the exposure field of a device will automatically be set to public. It will be highlighted in orange so that you are made aware of the fact that a device is communicating with IP addresses on the internet. So what you need to do in order to enable this is to tell your switches that those switches that are capable of NetFlow or SFlow to send their NetFlow or SFlow data to an OT-based Asset Discovery node, and during installation of that node, you can change the port number for this NetFlow collector if you have to use a non-standard port. But the actual configuration for this traffic to occur happens on the switches. And we also have a knowledge base article that will help you to do the appropriate configuration steps for Cisco switches. Since you do need the IP addresses of your asset discovery nodes, this task can only be started once that you have an initial set of asset discovery nodes up and running. So this is the next task. And for this configuration and testing of an initial set of asset discovery nodes, we have estimated 5 days. Certainly that is something that you want to fine tune depending on the number of nodes that you want to install in a first wave. However, the point is, at some point you will need to start with an initial set, because otherwise you won't see any asset data in Asset Center, and therefore other steps such as metadata setup, etc., to which we will get in a couple of minutes, will not be possible. So for this reason, you see the dependencies of that step here, of task number 17, with other steps. So a lot of what follows actually depends on this step to be completed. That also applies to the next task, the installation and configuration of OT-based Discovery Manager. That is an application which allows you to monitor your installed asset discovery nodes, and certainly you need to have those nodes up and running before it makes sense to use Discovery Manager. This is marked as optional because depending on your size and depending on your workflows, you may or may not want to use Discovery Manager. It is part of the standard distribution, so there is no extra license required. You can just check it out and see if it adds any value to your installation. Once that you have completed the configuration and testing of the initial set of asset discovery nodes, that means you have reached the second milestone. In the next block, we go back to OT-based Asset Center. Task number 21 is to add process definitions, device groups, and custom fields in Asset Center. And as you can see, this does not depend on asset discovery nodes to be up and running, but it does depend on OT-based Asset Center up and running, certainly. These additional metadata are in a way quite similar to the location data that we have discussed earlier. However, the location namespace is an absolute must. So you must finish this rather early, whereas this other data that we are talking about now, this is more like an option. You can use those additional metadata to enhance the granularity of your access control and also to add important information about your devices. You will find the relevant areas to input those metadata in the extended section in the inventory. There you have the device groups, there you have the physical processes, also the network groups and the system groups. However, usually they come a little bit later in the process. The difference is with the physical processes and the device groups, those can be used for access control. And therefore you should consider filling these fields early in the process. For the device groups, there is no reasonable default. So you can use whatever nomenclature, whatever groups might be useful for you. And for the physical processes, that might be a little bit different because this is usually determined by your physical processes, as the name suggests. So what you can do here is you can, once that you have defined such a process namespace, you can associate that namespace with individual OT devices, which will then allow you to define access rights based on the processes and also to search for devices across sites by referring to specific process steps. Then we have the custom fields, where you can add any database fields that you think were forgotten in the standard product, but which are important for you and for your organization. So this could be, just as a simple example, an SAP equipment ID, which is not part of the standard database that we provide, but you can simply add it in this extended section. And then you can add the relevant information for those fields, either manually or, which usually makes a lot of more sense, via the REST API. Talking about which, that would be the next task in our list. Once that you have defined your field, you will want to populate them. And whenever possible, you would want to do this using automation, which means you would take existing Excel tables, etc., or data from additional data sources, and in an automated step, load those data into OT-based Asset Center and populate your custom fields and your additional metadata. Since this only makes sense once that your database is populated with asset data, you will see that this task can only start a little bit further down the road, namely when you already have asset data in the database, so that when this task configuration and test of initial set of asset discovery nodes is completed. So therefore this explains this gap that you see between those two tasks. Next up is the creation of local user accounts. And if you're using Active Directory, the linkage to those Active Directory groups, which I have explained earlier, where you can tell OT-based simply about the existing user groups in Active Directory and also use that for single sign-on and for access control. Next step is reporting. You will strongly enhance the user experience if you configure stored views in Asset Center. It means that various filter settings in the device inventory, also in the software inventory and in the CVE workflow will be saved, and that also includes the scope. Let's look at an example. So let's just assume I am interested in my Rockwell PowerFlexes, PowerFlex 525, and I want to filter out PowerFlexes with firmware version 4 point something. Okay, and now I can save this view by clicking on this button and just call it PowerFlex 5.5 firmware 4. And I make it public so that other users can also access the view. And now this view appears in this drop down, and now I just need to select from the drop down, and then I get my stored view. The scope window also pops up in order to point out that there might be a location scope that was set, or in this case it tells me that it's about the global installed base. So adding a couple of those stored views will make it easier for your end users to find their way around in OT-based, so they don't need about all the flexibility with the filtering, etc., in order to execute their use cases. Next up is the email notifications. You need to set the the SMTP settings. Then you can define your email templates. With that being completed, you have reached your third milestone, where OT-base is functional with active users. So what else have we got? We have the installation of OT-base audit tools, which is optional. The audit tools are a product extension that you may or may not want to license. So it's about 3 tools: a report writer, a dashboard application, and an XLSX writer, which produces fancy spreadsheets. So they will enhance your reporting. And if you want to take advantage of these tools, you could install them once that you have reached the second milestone. So you don't need to wait for the third milestone. This is unrelated, because all you need for using, installing and using the audit tools is that you already have some asset data in OT-based Asset Center. Next up is the integration, which certainly is optional depending on your requirements. If you want to take advantage of integration capabilities, then what you also need is the second milestone completed, because otherwise you don't even have any test data about assets which you could experiment with. In any case, the integration is accomplished using the REST API, and you will find extensive documentation on it in this section in the knowledge base, which is called for integrators and developers. And there you have an extensive documentation for the REST API. Let me also point out that we also provide a Python SDK that makes using the REST API much simpler, specifically if you want to write custom code for importing additional data from existing CMDBs, etc. For Splunk, we have a standard technical add-on that you can take advantage of. Finally, it's all about the rollout of additional asset discovery nodes. Before you go about installing, let's just say, hundreds of those nodes, you want to make sure that you have checked for automation. There are two areas where you could apply automation. The first is the configuration of your discovery nodes, which means, for example, providing individual location IDs to devices or providing individual access credentials. And that can be done via the REST API of OT-based asset discovery, which we haven't discussed yet. So we have looked at the REST API for Asset Center, but OT-based asset discovery has its own REST API. And that REST API allows you to change configuration settings of asset discovery. For deployment, you want to check if you can use SCCM or additional similar methods for automated software distribution. We strongly encourage you to use that. So as far as the installation process of asset discovery is concerned, we do offer a silent mode, which means that is a mode where we don't assume that a user or an administrator is clicking buttons. And once that those steps are completed, then you can go about and configure and test your second wave of asset discovery nodes. And certainly this activity can be finished in a week, or maybe it stretches over months, depending on the size of your deployment. Certainly, if you're deploying hundreds of nodes, that is going to take longer than if you're just deploying dozens of nodes. So that's it. I encourage you to download this project here and make the appropriate adjustments in Microsoft Project. So just adjust the durations here that you think are required and use that as an implementation plan. If you just look at the big picture, it will give you a good idea of what usually is involved in the implementation. So you can use that as a roadmap, but you can also use that as a planning tool if you go into the details and maybe also provide responsibilities, etc. And that will help you to streamline your OT-based implementation process.